Today, we have a one-on-one conversation with America's top diplomat on Africa as we say farewell to him as he prepares to end his distinguished career in the Foreign Service.
And coming up later in our STA inbox, you, our audience, have weighed in through your emails and social media comments. We'll reveal some of them ahead on Straight Talk Africa.
But first, the experiment that is democracy is currently being played out across Africa. In Kenya, we are seeing it up close right now with a test of that nation's institutions, leaders, and people. One distinguished American diplomat, Johnnie Carson, has been a pillar of support for African democracy during his entire career. My colleague Paul Cisco has more.
Dedication to democracy and human rights is a shared value that links the American people with the populations throughout Africa.
A volunteer in former U.S. President John F. Kennedy's Peace Corps in Tanzania during the 1960s, Ambassador Johnnie Carson is today America's leading voice on African affairs in the Obama administration's 4 pillars approach to Africa.
It focuses on building partnerships with governments, civil societies, and populations across the African continent to strengthen democratic institutions, spur economic growth, trade, and investment, advance peace and security, and promote opportunity and development.
He served as U.S. ambassador to Uganda in the early 1990s, where Yoweri Museveni was then and is still president, and as the U.S. ambassador to Zimbabwe from 1995 to 1997, where Robert Mugabe is still president, but where support for a newly drafted constitutional referendum may be paving the way for elections this year and presidential term limits. From 1999 to 2003, he was the U.S. ambassador to Kenya. Kenya led then by President Daniel Arap Moi, followed by President Mwai Kibaki. Today, Kenya wrestles with a challenged presidential vote and the recent election of President-elect Uhuru Kenyatta. Early in the administration, he traveled with Secretary Clinton to Kenya and Liberia, and with the president to Ghana. He spoke out for democracy in Nigeria at the sudden death of President Umaru Yar'Adua in 2010. Assistant Secretary Carson communicated U.S. support for a swift and peaceful conclusion to the election turmoil in the Ivory Coast.
When the situation on the ground in Côte d'Ivoire became intolerable, we actively encouraged the United Nations to act.
Carson says democracy in Africa has made steady and impressive progress. He cites witnessing the handing over of power to a democratically elected president in Somalia after 2 decades of civil war.
This effort was led by Africans, but it enjoyed significant U.S. support.
He rejoices at the end of Africa's longest civil war and the new nation of the Republic of South Sudan. Today, the U.S. supports African, Malayan government and international efforts to restore democracy to the people of Mali.
We support an accelerated ECOWAS troop deployment and the provision of assistance to African forces. We support also the creation of a strategic roadmap and a timetable that will restore democratic governance.
And in the eastern DRC,
where more than 5 million people have been killed during 15 years of violence, the United States is working with the UN, the European Union, and regional partners to identify immediate and long-term solutions to end the Eastern Congo's cycle of instability, violence, and conflict.
He recently brought this message to the Great Lakes region.
We want to see more enduring progress in the Great Lakes. It is in the interest of all of the regional states. It is in the interest of the international community, but most importantly, it is in the interest of ending the enormous suffering that has gone on there for far too long.
Ambassador Johnnie Carson's distinguished diplomatic career may be coming to a close, but his steadfast support for the democratic aspirations of the African people is never ending. Paul Cisco, VOA News.
Thanks, Paul, for that interesting report. Now, joining us here in our Washington studios is our distinguished guest, Ambassador Johnnie Carson, U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. Ambassador Carson, as always, it is terrific, of course, to have you back on this program.
Thank you very much, Shaka. It's a pleasure to be back with you.
I have to say that over the years, I have had, of course, the opportunity to interact with you, to learn a lot, and I've also been able, I hope, to challenge you in some cases on some policy issues.
It's always been stimulating, it's always been interesting, and it's always been collegial, and I appreciate the opportunity that I've had to appear with you on your program.
You definitely deserve congratulations for the 37 years that you have actually been part of the U.S. Foreign Service.
It's a long time, but I think it's been professionally rewarding for me and personally rewarding for me, and I think the last 4 years under the leadership of President Obama and the skillful hand and leadership of Secretary of State Clinton has been marvelous. I think that we've accomplished a great deal, and we've worked hard to strengthen the partnership, which we think is important for strengthening our relations between Washington and the African continent.